have had an incredible day. I helped to organize this, but I swear to God, I was thinking if I had missed this, I would be real angry with myself because the panels were so excellent, the speakers were great, Laura was fantastic, James was great, I mean, covering all the areas that sometimes you don't think about with a poet in terms of their social, historical engagement and stuff like that. And so we have had a great time, and Joanne being here and sharing with us that first book and how it came. By the way, we have 2 letters that Joanne sent to Sterling that are actually on the wall over here. One is when she wrote about, she wrote to Stephen Henderson to say, hey, I'm going to start this thing. And then the other letter is when she wrote to Sterling to say, you know, I have met, I'm sorry, one is her thanking Sterling and Daisy for allowing her to come and interview him. The second is a letter that she wrote to Sterling about her interview with Arthur Davis. Now that is someone that we don't hear enough about, is Arthur Davis, but Arthur Davis made an enormous contribution and worked with Sterling and was a friend as far as I know. And so it's really interesting to see that, and you see Sterling and his wife, Daisy, and she talks about, Joanne mentions her, you know, meeting and how wonderful that visit was. And Joanne talked earlier about the picture of her daughter. I was moved the same way when I saw the correspondence, because I had gotten correspondence from Williams College, and I thought, oh, Ethelbert, we should give this to Joanne. So I'm glad somebody else gave it to you. You at least got it. So that was really terrific that you got that, and that he kept it. And so that mattered a lot. The other thing is we have another poster over here where you see Sterling in the listening room, which is his basement, where he has a bunch of people, a bunch of students who are listening to music. And you see him with his record collection. Williams Special Collections has gathered his playlist, which is 3,300 songs. We have a QR code that has that playlist. So you can look there on that poster and take a picture of that QR code, and you can start listening to the songs he listened to, and maybe it will affect your poetry as well. So we want to thank Williams again for all the work that all the effort and work that they gave in involving us. Lisa, you're next.
All right, we are the last leg, guys. We're hanging in there. We got this. This is like the relay race. I'm a track runner, so this is it. You're gonna hang in there for our moderator. So it's my pleasure and honor to introduce the moderator for this panel, Shaping the Future from the Mecca. Dr. Dana A. Williams, Professor of African American Literature and Dean of the Graduate School of Howard University. I'm going to say the Mecca. Let me say that again. Dr. Dana A. Williams, Professor of African American Literature and Dean of the Graduate School of Howard University. She is the first woman to hold this permanent deanship. Like, let's give her some snaps right there. She's a renowned scholar. She's the author and editor of multiple influential works, including In the Light of Likeness, Transform, The Literary Art of Leon, Toni at Random. Dr. Williams is a dedicated leader in the Academy. She has served in prominent leadership roles, including as past president of the College Language Association, the Toni Morrison Society, and the Modern Language Association. In 2016, she was appointed by President Barack Obama in the National Humanities Council, and she continues to serve on several national boards dedicated in advancing scholarships and the humanities. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Dana A. Williams.
Good afternoon, everyone. I see Tricia Elam coming. Before I make the introductions, and thank you for the intro. I asked for the shorter one, but we got what we got. So I'm excited to share the space with you all today. As you heard, the title of the panel is Shaping the Future from the Mecca, Sterling A. Brown as intellectual guide and sculptor of a new generation of writers. And we follow directions. So we were told to have a discussion and we'll be asking questions. So that's what we'll do. I'm sure along with those questions, there will be some remarks that may have taken the form of some scholarly engagement, but we're gonna do our rounds of questions as we were instructed to do. I'll do short introductions because you have the intros in your packet, of course. Tricia Elam Walker is an award-winning author, attorney, and educator. Her first novel, Breathing Room, was published by Simon & Schuster. Her work has also appeared in the Washington Post, the Baltimore Sun, Essence, and other publications. Her short stories have been included in the O. Henry Prize Stories, New Stories from the South, and other anthologies, and her essays have been published in Father's Song, Dream Me Home Safely, It's All About Love, and other collections. Hibernian Hall produced her plays, Bold Moves and With Glittering Eyes, and her two children's books, Nana Akua Goes to School and Dream Street, were published by Random House during the pandemic. Tricia is Associate Professor of Creative Writing at Howard University. Please join me in welcoming Tricia Elam Walker. Marcia Davis is an experienced journalist who's passionately committed to truth squatting and accountability, and I love that, truth squad, yes. A mentor and storyteller, her work focuses on issues that include politics, government, race, class, and culture, and their intersections with social inequality. In other words, she tells stories that matter to our lives. And that, of course, reminded me of the Toni K. Bambara essay, Salvation is the Issue. We tell stories that save lives. She's worked for the Washington Post, the Marshall Project, and NPR, and she is the keeper of the former home of Sterling Brown. Please join me in welcoming Marcia Davis. Jonetta asked me to provide just a little bit of context for the conversation, and I'll do that rather briefly to talk a little bit about the legacy of Sterling Brown at Howard, particularly in the English department where I served as chair for 9 years. It was like 8 years and some months, and I thought I was going home to finish a book and then became interim dean of the graduate school. So I can't even say quite 9 years. But what I can share with you is that my time and awareness of the legacy of Sterling Brown in English at Howard really started for me as a graduate student. Under the direction of Eleanor W. Traylor, the Department of English at Howard co-opted even, the legacy of Sterling Allen Brown Jr. as its guiding intellectual light. We had no shortage of luminaries who walked the hallowed halls after whom we could have modeled ourselves. There, of course, was Zora Neale Hurston, Lucille Clifton, Amiri Baraka, Toni Morrison even. But it was Sterling Brown who best embodied a profound commitment to representing the voices, the experiences, and the cultural expressions of Black America within and beyond literary and cultural traditions. His work in this regard was unmatched. A poet, a folklorist, a critic, a teacher, a mentor, a provocateur, Sterling Brown bridged the gap between academic scholarship and vernacular culture. He elevated the oral tradition, blues and spirituals, to the level of serious literary study, not to be compared to the so-called greats, but to help us to see the transformative power of culture in the quest for historical truth and a better understanding of a shared human dignity. Socially engaged, culturally responsive, DEI, all of these catchphrases that are contemporary are born out of an understanding that Sterling Brown had long ago, that the humanities could help us uniquely to see ourselves and to solve problems of the human condition. What we have all been seeking and continue to seek is best embodied in the poem After Winter, where we have survived and now it is time to run, to be free. The goal of the department, when I was a student there, under Eleanor's tenure, and then again as I became chair, was to provide for everyone who came through those halls running space. We are grateful to Sterling Brown for that guide. So we'll really move through some questions that are about Sterling Brown, but then also really about that legacy and what it means for the future as it relates to cultural studies, the legacies in DC and at Howard in its English department and beyond. And we want to start really with thinking about Sterling Brown as a teacher. And I'll start this one, ask this question to Tricia, and they'll be interlocutors with each other, and I'll chime in when it's time for us to move towards another question. But Sterling Brown taught at Howard for over 40 years. What do you think it means for a writer to stay rooted in one institution or community for that long? And how might that space shape that influence?
Well, I think that with Sterling Brown, it's almost as if he's embedded in the walls, at Howard. I mean, he's just part of the fabric. And we have a Sterling Brown Association. We have a Sterling Brown Notes, where students publish work through that journal. He's a presence. He's a fixture. And I think that's because he was there so long, and the influence he had on people who we consider literary giants. You mentioned Toni Morrison, Mary Baraka, Marcia Davis, Luger Clifton. So I think that, for that reason, he is, just as I said, embedded in the walls and makes such a difference in terms of students, how we move through the institution and what they know about him.
Yeah, I would agree with that. One of the things that people would say often who weren't as familiar with him and his legacy and what it meant at Howard, people would say, so what's the difference between all these different Sterling Brown things? Mm-hmm. Because we had the Sterling Brown English Association, and so we was like, oh, take that, invite the Sterling Brown Club to come. And they were like, well, are they different from the people who do Sterling Notes?
Right.
Everything was Sterling. It was literally like Sterling Brown this. And then, of course, once we were finally able to endow the Sterling Brown chairs, does the Sterling Brown chair work with Sterling Notes? What's its relation to Amistad? It seemed like the whole world revolved around Sterling Brown, in part because he did have that kind of reach and influence and legacy. So, Marcia, as someone who lives in Brown's former home, how has that space spoken to you, if you will? And do you feel a kind of presence of legacy there, even if you aren't thinking about it directly in the way that we've heard about that history today?
Hi, everybody. It's really nice to be here, and I have to start by thanking Jonetta and Ethelbert and so many people, and it's so nice to have Joanne Gavin here. It's so wonderful, and Mark Sanders, and just everybody. It's so nice to have you all here. I have to say that I first came into that home, and the first thing I noticed were the bookcases, the floor-to-ceiling bookcases. And I walked into the small dining room, and I noticed more bookcases. And then I walked into the small study, and it was surrounded by 4 walls of bookcases. And at the time, I didn't know who owned that house or who had owned the house. And it was a very interesting dynamic. First of all, I have to say that I had a writing book club, a workshop before I moved into the house. So I was already primed to be the person who now owns that house. But I came out onto the street and a taxi stopped right in front of me. And a woman got out and she said, "Are you interested in that house?" And I said, "I could be." And really, I really loved the house already. And the agent who had brought me to the house was already in her car. And so the woman asked me, "Do you know who lived in that house?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Sterling Brown lived in that house." And I said, "Sterling Brown?" And she said, "Sterling," I said, "The Sterling Brown?" And she said, "Yes." And I was like, how could there be just this house sitting there with no plaque, nothing? And it just, I was taken away by that. And she said to me in kind of a stage whisper, she said, "Are you interested in that house?" And I said, "Yeah, I could be interested in that house." And she says, "Well, white people have lived in that house for too long." And it was a comedic moment for us, but she had been a student of Sterling Brown's. And she lived in the house with her husband, Reverend William Calvert. Some of you may know him or knew of him, but her name was Madeline Calvert. Both are now our ancestors now. But it was just an important moment for me. And at that time, I knew I had to have that house. And it was a long story. I won't bore you with it, but eventually it was my house, and I've lived there for many years, yes. So it's just a really inspirational thing to know that I live in this house that belonged to this literary giant. It's just a great sense of purpose. That literary book club, one of them is here now. Raise your hand. But we haven't met in many years. Did you? I didn't know you came. So, see, I don't even know all the people who came to the book clubs, to the writing workshops. But we may start them again. I don't know. But it's an important legacy, and it's really a joy to be living there. So.
I appreciate, especially because that's what I said to Marcia when she came up, and I was, we don't know each other very formally, but I went to hug, and she was like, "Oh, hey," kind of like, "Who are you?" And I was like, "I've been in your house, don't worry about it." She's like, "Okay," but the fact of the matter is a lot of people have been in your house. In the house, in part because you make it an open space for people. And as somebody who's tried to go to every black house in DC, like I went in Georgia Johnson Douglas's house when it was on the market, maybe the second to the last time, knowing I couldn't afford it, but I was like, this house is on the market, I'm gonna act like I'm buying this house because I'm going in this house. I wanna see it, I wanna feel the energy, I wanna see what's happening in here. So we appreciate the way with which you make the space open. Was that a conscious decision? Is that like kind of fundamental to who you are anyway, or was there some merger of those things?
It is a fundamental part of who I am. I'm from St. Louis, but to be a part of a community is an important part of my life. And when I won't give you all the details of getting this house, but when I had to write to the owner, and I said, "This is my house." And the house was under contract to someone else. And so I had to write, and I wrote, and I told him, this is my house. I belong in this house. This is, I need to live here. And eventually, I did, and I am. And it just became just very important to me, and it's an important part of my life. Yeah.
I appreciate that. Tricia, as a writer, as we think about the way that Sterling Brown used the voices and the rhythms of everyday life, how important is it for you to do that kind of work in your own writing, but then also to make sure that the students that you are teaching have access to the kind of language and rhythm that we see in Sterling Brown's work?
I mean, I love that about his work. It makes me think about Zora Neale Hurston, too, lifting up and privileging those, natural voices, dignifying them. It's almost like those voices are the percussive aspect, of our language. And it's very important because, oftentimes you read things about the way Black people speak and its stereotypes, et cetera. But that's not what he did, and that's not what Zora did either. And I think for students, it's so important because we have students from everywhere. And I remember one year, somebody did this survey of all the different slangs across the campus, using certain words like people call pop or soda or whatever. But that was also a way of uplifting, the dialect, the slang, et cetera. And I know I really encourage students to use that in their writing, to be themselves, to be authentic. And, that's a legacy that he left us.
And to be transparent, that often gets us in trouble.
Well, yeah.
Because we tell students, like the opening line in the department's first-year writing program is, you are heirs to a great tradition of people who have equated oral and written expression as tantamount to freedom or something like that. And then we tell them that they have their own home language and that they have to value their home language, and they better not ever let anybody anywhere ever tell them anything about their home language. And then they turn their papers in, and we're like, yeah, no, this ain't working. And they're like, yeah, but this is my home language. And we're like, you have to understand what that means.
You have to be bilingual.
Yes, you have to be bilingual, and you have to understand what it means. So one of the ways that doing that is really, again, we'll lift up Sterling Brown to say, unless you can chart this as having a system of being, you're really being lazy. Like, you're really saying, like, I can get away with absolutely anything. So sometimes it turns against us, and one of the exercises that we can use to, like, really get them back there is, this rhythm isn't arbitrary. It all has to work. It's the same argument that we do as we connect them with the Ebonics and kind of African-American vernacular English to really help them understand this is a system. You can't just make it up as you go along. And if you do, it too has to become like its own system. And it's real interesting because so many students come from so many different places that the melding of those languages becomes really interesting.
And I think, it's important for them to know, what the language of currency is, as well as what the, you can't hear?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. It's important for students to know what the language of currency is, as well as, their own language. And that's one of the reasons I'm so happy I teach creative writing now, because I started out teaching freshman writing, which of course was more expository writing, and they did have to conform. But yeah, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I'm teaching at Trinity now, and
it's on, but I think it's just like kind of unidirectional. You almost have to do it like this.
Okay. So I'm teaching at Trinity now, and I'm teaching journalism, and it's very important for young people to know not only their language and the history of that language, but to know just history in general. I had some people in my class just this last week didn't know what the Vietnam War was. That's incredible. And it's just a really poverty of knowledge that we find ourselves faced with, and we just can't live like that. So
yeah, I agree. I remember the time when I would ask students, like, when were you born? Like in the 2000s, and now the answer is absolutely. Like, as a matter of fact, I wasn't even born in 2000. Like 2000 was still like predates them. I do want you to stay with that line of thinking though, as around talking about journalism, to think about storytelling. Telling stories was so much at the heart of what Sterling Brown did with his poetry, with his essays, with his public lectures, the conversations. How do you see the power of storytelling shaping communities today? And it's the power and the potential of storytelling in the work that you do as someone who teaches journalism to convey to students why storytelling is important.
Well, I think that life is about stories, and that in order to capture life, we have to be able to talk about the stories that we live and what that means. And I think that for so many people, understanding that concept that everybody has a story to tell, everybody does, that is the essence of journalism, really. Yeah. It really is to be able to tell people's stories and to tell your own stories. So I think that's important to nurture with people. The other thing, though, is that it's frustrating sometimes, too, because we live in this incredibly interesting, I'll say interesting, world where social media allows people to tell all kinds of stories. And sometimes they don't tell the right stories, meaning they don't tell the correct stories, or people lie about stories, or, you know, some people in the media lie about stories, and we find ourselves too many times believing those stories. And so it's important for them to capture the essence of what they know about their own story, and then to understand that it's understanding that helps them to convey the stories that people tell them, and that's important. So it's the whole concept of telling stories is so critical. And the other thing with Sterling Brown is that not only did he talk about, language, but he really understood the stories that people tell and appreciated the stories that people told him about what their lives were like. Yeah. And that's what we have to capture as a journalist.
And I think that especially during this time where so many folks are trying to erase our stories, that it's super important. And one of the things I start out with in terms of a prompt with students is tell me the story of your name. And just by that, with that simple prompt, so much comes out, and we learn so much about each other through that. And I feel like Sterling Brown, his influence is in there in terms of how important those stories are.
When you think about truth-telling, and I'm also thinking about all of the people who told stories about going to Sterling Brown's house so he could tell tall tales. So there's truth-telling, and then there is like tall tales as art, but also thinking about the influence that you might have on another generation. Mentoring is so incredibly important. How does that impact that next generation, especially as you were talking about like students not understanding the war? So you have to stop and you have to teach it, but then there is also that mentoring element. If you ever heard Amiri Baraka talk about Sterling Brown, or Toni Morrison talk about Sterling Brown, or Jeremiah Wright talk about Sterling Brown, it was what happened in the classroom, but then aside from that informal mentoring that happens. How do we bring that legacy to the fore as well?
Well, I think we need more Sterling Browns now. And there are some of us who do that and bring people into our homes and into our lives. But we need to be able, can you hear me?
No. He's saying no.
Okay, what I was saying was that we need more Sterling Browns in our lives, and in the ability to help people understand that they have stories to tell, and to hear other people, older people, to tell those. I know, to tell stories that tell their stories and to understand that that's really important and to tell those narratives. But I think it's important. It's important to bring people into our lives. That's what's really, it's really what makes the difference, I think, and it's really what makes the difference for people. One of the things that I know Sterling did was, he didn't recruit, but he knocked on NAG's door, the Nonviolent Action Group, and brought them into his home. And those young people were eventually became a part of SNCC. And that whole idea of what that meant for them is so important because he helped to shape a generation of fighters and people who understood what that meant when they went into the South to fight for the right to vote. But part of that is that he helped to build up the courage to fight that fight and to win it. So I think it's important to have people do that.
I did not know Sterling Brown, but I do know people who did. One of my friends, I did not know Sterling Brown, but I do know people who did. And one of my friends, her father was taught by Sterling Brown, and he has told her stories about how students went to his house, your house, I guess. Mm-hmm. They continued the dialogue in the classroom, later on, and how important that was to this particular person who's relating this story. And I do feel like that legacy continues at Howard, and it's also so necessary because we have students come from all over, who come from all kinds of different situations, many first generation, many students who don't know how they're gonna, pay the next round of tuition, students who have been through trauma, students who come from PWIs, who've been through trauma at PWIs. And I just remember, particularly after the pandemic, how many students were dealing with mental health issues. Mm-hmm. And so the work had to continue beyond the classroom, and that's another aspect of his legacy.
It's kind of an unfair question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So imagine a 21st century or 2025 Sterling Brown. Either who would you say that might look like, or what does that look like?
I think we have that. I think Nicole Hannah-Jones at Howard, I've seen her, how she maneuvers, she takes students on trips, she builds in that after class time. I've seen it with people like Greg Carr, I've seen it with, many professors who go beyond just the whatever the day looks like, to carry on those conversations, to help students who don't have what they need, to advocate on behalf of students, to support students as they struggle. Sometimes we've had all kinds of situations at Howard. In '68, I think, Sterling Brown helped students who were dealing with taking over because they wanted, taking over the buildings because they wanted a different curriculum. He worked with them to get that, to have more Black studies. He was very instrumental in that. And so, yeah.
Okay, so I think that it's so important for people to have these mentors and to have the extra class time outside of class. It just really makes the big difference in people's lives, in their lives, and that's what Sterling Brown did. And as Tricia said, that there are people now like Hannah, who I know, and other young people, other professors like Robin D.G. Kelly, for example, is a really important professor to know, and others like that. And so I think that there are some, but I think we need, so many more. We need everybody who should take people into their orbit and help them understand their lives and to explain the lives of others. So.
And maybe everybody doesn't want to necessarily open their homes, but I certainly do take students to Sankofa, to Starbucks, to other places that are nearby, which of course was around when Sterling Brown was doing this. And so, that work does continue, and it's very important.
I think it's also important to note that it might not look the same either in the way of students who approach you. Sometimes now we have to do the outreach. I can remember being a graduate student, like every time I saw somebody whose work I had read, I just went up to them and introduced myself. And I had a standard line: I appreciate your work. That's it. Like, hi, I'm Dana Williams. I've read fill in the blank, and I appreciate your work. But we also had these communities where conferences especially, so I work in English studies and literatures and languages, and so there's always been the MLA and there's always been the CLA. So you go to CLA and you see Joanne and her crew, and you scared at first, but then they embrace you before they're like, young person, hi, what's your name? So I think we also have to make sure that we are engaging people and not always, because they aren't always going to come to me. And I had to check myself even with that, because I said, yeah, good mentoring. Like the kids got to approach me first, and then I'm on. But I'm not going to seek you out. And then I thought about it. Somebody sought me out. I mean, especially if I'm thinking about the way that Dr. Traylor and I began, because we fought first. Literally, she sent me, she's like, go do this, go do this, go do this. And I was like, all right, I'll do this and this, but I'm not doing that. And she looked at me like, and the thing was, everybody in the room who knows her knows she smoked cigarettes for a long time. I was like, nah, I'm not going to Texaco for you. I'll go to Florida Avenue Grill. And she looked like, huh, okay. And then I was like, yep, we got to be friends, because otherwise we're going to fight. So I think that there are these experiences where we have the opportunity to sit at the feet of people, and I still feel that way very often when I'm in certain spaces with people who have much more experience. That to me is a kind of Sterling Brown moment, like just sit, be quiet, listen, and have the opportunity to engage. I want to talk now just a little bit, and then we'll open the floor for questions about any connections you see between place, memory, and creativity. Does place and memory make a difference in what stories we are now able to tell? And I'm thinking about it especially from the perspective of there aren't but so many stories to tell in the world. It's how you interpret them differently in a contemporary moment so that they're relevant for a contemporary moment that matters. So as we're thinking about how people can tell stories in a moment like 2025, in a moment like September 2025, or whatever may happen tomorrow or the next week, how does place, memory, how do those things interact with creativity? Tricia has no peripheral vision. I just want y'all to know. Like, Marcia was reaching for the thing, and she was like, yes.
Oh,
She's like, I don't see what's happening over here.
Weren't you asking both of us?
Yes.
Oh, sorry, Marcia.
Marcia.
No, only because that's one of my assignments, so I just wanted to talk to that, of having students talk about a place that's important to them. It could be a bedroom, it could be someone's house, it could be a field, a park, whatever, but making that connection and the memory, as you're talking about, making that connection of a place that's important or a place that's safe or has some meaning to them. And then through that, they reveal a lot about themselves as well, and understand more about themselves. And then they're also sharing with others who they are, which is so important, particularly in a writing class, because writing is so personal and people need to be vulnerable, and people also have to deal with hearing critiques of their work. So establishing a safe place is really important, and that's one of the ways.
Yeah, I agree with that. Place is so important in terms of helping to deal with memory, and that we find that, having to be in a place or going back to a place or just remembering the place helps to shape what happened in that place, and sometimes helps you, hopefully, better understand why it happened and what the reasons were that it happened. And that's so important. As Tricia said, the whole idea of what people remember is at the core of who they are, and sometimes those memories, it can be fluid too. So the ability to be able to pin those memories down and then to follow them is what makes the difference. And place is very important. So I just think it's just critical. So.
Thank you. Our last question is related to the poem, and in the tradition of what I heard with the other panels as well, I want to really lift up some lines from a poem from Sterling Brown. The one I've chosen, obviously, is After Winter. He snuggles his fingers in the blacker loam. The lean months are done with, the fat to come. His eyes are set on a brushwood fire, but his heart is soaring higher and higher. Though he stands ragged an old scarecrow, this is the way he shifts thoughts to go. Butterbeans for Clara, sugar cone for Grace, and for the little fella, running space. Radishes and lettuce, eggplants and beets, turnips for the winter and candied sweets, homespun tobacco, apples in the bin for smoking and for cider when the folks drop in. He thinks with the winter his troubles are gone, 10 acres unplanted to raise dreams on. The lean months are done with, the fat to come. His hopes, winter wanderers, hasten home. Butterbeans for Clara, sugar cone for Grace, and for the little fella, running space. What does running space look like for you today?
For me, running space is literally that, the ability to run. You know, what is it that you are able to do? Yeah. What is your vision, and how do you live that vision? And for me, that is exactly what, you know, running space means, that, you know, that you have the freedom to be able to explore your lives and the lives of others, and no limits. Yeah. That's what's important.
Yeah, I definitely think it's freedom. It means freedom in terms of who you are, who you want to be, and what do you want to do with your life. And for me, I just came back from a writing retreat where there were no distractions, and I could just do my work, and that felt like running space.
Yeah. So much of it is imagination too. Like thinking about, like, we know that there will be an after winter period, and we are looking for the running space, looking forward to the running space, but we got to be ready if we get it. Yeah, so that imagination that's there. We want to open the floor now for questions. I think we have probably 5 minutes, would you say? All right, 10 minutes for any questions? Yes, Halia. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for your time here today in this panel. As a young person and coming from a family who has a couple of Howard students, cool. My name is Halia Ben. First of all, I'm a sophomore Africana Studies major from Altadena, California. I'm at Howard University, and my siblings also went. Thank you. I have two sisters who graduated. One was class of 2018, the other was class of 2021, and I'm entering some of the same spaces that they were in, adding to this Africana tradition and this cultural meaning making, these ways of knowing, and the numbers are starting to decrease. Our generation, with the media we have and the technology we have, our attention spans are starting to decrease. And the classroom looks different in terms of participation. The classroom looks different in terms of the method of learning and how we reach each other as generations. So I'm thinking about what is the work to be done on being an intergenerational interlocutor. So how do we help, just in a straightforward way, reciprocate the effort that you guys put into reaching us when things are changing, but you're still trying to keep this tradition?
Yep, so the question in short is, what is the work for intergenerational exchanges? Both what do we see ourselves as giving, but then also how do the younger generation, what is the way that the younger generation has to, what are those responsibilities as well?
Yeah. Just trying to get the question clear. So I think that the intergenerational relationship is just that it's both sides dealing with what their lives are like and then being able to communicate that, what their lives are like. And I think that's on both sides. You know, the older generation has to be able to convey what their lives were like, how it's different now. And that's where I think both sides have to be able to talk about their lives and how things can be different, how things were different, how things are now, and what the future can be like.
Yeah, I mean, it's a cliche, but the youth are the future, and I think I really understand the importance of that. So it is a sharing, like I think Marcia was saying, in terms of, you know, the back and forth with me hearing and listening to what students are dealing with, what they feel like they need, what they're unsure about, and then me sharing, you know, thoughts about that as well as my own experiences and what I've learned from them in terms of how that can help them with whatever they're dealing with. And there's a lot of that. There's a lot of back and forth. I have mandatory one-on-one meetings with students in whatever classes I'm teaching, just for that reason, to almost have like a home visit with them to find out more of who they are, because you don't always find out in the classroom. So.
And one thing I remember finding out when I was doing freshman seminar is talking to students who thought that office hours meant that that's the time not to disturb faculty. Literally. So it's like, you know, you have these we have office hours. Why didn't you come to office hours? And kids just look kind of like blank stare at me. I said, no, seriously, like why didn't you go see the person during office hours? And she said, I didn't know. I thought that meant like that's the time not to, that was the time that the person was teaching or grading or something. So the kind of transparency that we have to have, because we take for granted being in the space for so long that everybody knows what we know. I remember similarly, like having to, like I kept saying like, it's on the syllabus. And the student was like not knowing, because if you're not hearing something called a syllabus in high school, you don't know what a syllabus is more than anything. So part of it, I think, is meeting people where they are on both sides. So if there is a faculty member who is saying we can talk if you're moving, like if you're walking with me, we can talk, then you have to meet the person where they are, even though your own disposition may be, I want to sit down one-on-one uninterrupted. Sometimes that may or may not be an option. And then trust on both sides. Like, how do you establish trust, and how do you show up for people repeatedly on both sides? And then I would agree completely. Like, the first thing that came to mind for me was listening. Yes. Like, listening on both sides. Oh, man, I learn more from young people. Like, and I really don't have a choice now because they're sassier. Because I remember, like, giving something to someone, said, hey, like, make this work. And I was like, why didn't you do that? And he's like, remember, this is your project, not mine. And I was like, I would have never said that to a faculty member. He's like, yeah, you need to learn how to do this yourself. I can't keep doing this for you. And that's what you would tell me, right? And I was like, yes. So I became the student. So I think the trust and the exchange on both sides is really important as well.
Well, I think the idea of listening is so important. Being able to hear too, because it's not just someone talking to you, but it's also being able to hear what they're saying, and that makes all the difference.
Yep. All right. Well, then please join me in thanking our panelists. And a big thanks again to our organizers. I don't think that we can talk about, think about, really ruminate on Sterling Brown enough. So thank you, and Ethelbert, thank you, and the team.
We have 2 more books we're going to give, but I wanted to say this that was amazing to me. In your packet, there is a sheet that says, "Want to know more?" And so we've done some links for you if you want to know more. One of the more is an interview that Sterling did with Grace Cavallari. Grace Cavallari, Ethelbert Miller, and James Early were strategic to getting Sterling appointed the first poet laureate of DC. And so we thank them for making sure he got that appointment and that honor. In the Grace Cavallari interview, she asked Sterling about being a teacher, and he says in that interview that until a few years before that interview, he never thought he was a good teacher. But now he and Daisy have come to understand that he was, in fact, a good teacher. And I'm thinking, really, seriously? He didn't realize that? And he said it was from talking to a student who took, I think it was a seminar class, actually, where Sterling said he had, like at least 100 students or something. And this young man actually was in that class, and Sterling couldn't remember him, but the guy was able to tell him about, lessons that he had taught and how it had impacted him and all of that. And I'm sure other people would have been able to do that at some point. And so it was amazing to me that here's a guy who's actually natural-born teacher who had done it for 40 years and only 5 years, and he was in retirement at that point, that he really felt that he had actually been a good teacher. And he's so good that he has, like I said, left a legacy, but a whole community, when you talk about intergenerational, a whole community of young people who are, in some ways, following in his footsteps. So we thank him. He's not here, but we thank him, we thank his family, and I thank you all for being here. Thank you very much. I'll turn it over to Ethelbert now.
Jonetta, don't go anywhere. Jonetta, yeah, I have something for you.
Oh my God.
Okay. Because you've done so much work, and everybody is deeply grateful for everything that you've done, okay? This woman was sending emails at 5 o'clock in the morning. I knew you weren't getting any sleep. But what you've done is remarkable, and I just want to thank you for it.
Thank you.
All right. I'm going to make some closing remarks. I came to Washington, D.C. from the South Bronx in 1968. As I tell people often, in New York, I attended, Paul Laurence Dunbar Junior High School, 120, but they never taught us any poems by Paul Laurence Dunbar. So when I came here in 68, I didn't know Sterling Brown, but I happened to live in Cook Hall Dormitory, and I was next door to a person by the name of Steve Jones, who was an architectural student, a little older than I am. And Steve Jones was from Chicago, and he worked for Margaret Burroughs at the Dussault Museum. And Margaret Burroughs wanted something from Sterling Brown, like a pipe. And so Steve was next door to me, and he said, well, I'm going to go over to Sterling Brown's house. I happened to be working in the African American Studies Department. We were one of the first units to have the videotape machines. And so I tagged along with Steve Jones to just record Sterling Brown. Sterling Brown loved to talk. And so he invited us back, after one taping. And while that's going on, we were going back and forth taping Sterling Brown. Stephen Henderson was one of my mentors. Stephen Henderson was teaching a course in the African American Studies Department, Blue Soul and Black Identity and Problems in the Black Aesthetic. Around that time also, around 1973, Andrew Billingsley, very important, would create the Institute for Arts and Humanities. And that will enable Stephen Henderson to become the director of it. I believe the first director we were trying to get was Houston Baker, okay? But what happened, it wound up being Stephen Henderson. And what Henderson did was bring Sterling Brown out of retirement, okay? He also decided that, well, one of the things that is very important is documenting stuff. So because we had been documenting Sterling Brown, once the Institute for Arts and Humanities was created, it was an opportunity to say, okay, let's make sure we do that the Institute has an archival, recording unit. And that was very important in terms of documenting not just Sterling Brown. Now, Henderson did something that was extremely important with the tapes that we did of Sterling Brown. He said, let's transcribe those tapes. And because we transcribed those tapes, if you look at Joanne Gabbin's book in the back, with her bibliography, listening to the interviews and stuff, you see the interviews that Steve Jones did, that I recorded. I think there's another ones that James Early and I did. But what happened, we began to document, okay, the life of Sterling Brown. That is so important because look at what we're doing today, okay? Joanne has this book, okay? We have to consider the fact that every single day we make history. But while we make history, we also have to every single day record it and analyze it. And we have to make sure that the things that we learn get passed on to another generation. Okay? And that is extremely important. I end on this in terms of one, the other thing I found out when I came here, people would refer to Sterling Brown as the poet laureate of DC. Well, he wasn't. It's like saying, okay, Malcolm X Park. Well, actually Meridian Hill if you go downtown. And it might be Meridian Hill again because of this administration. But what happens is that, you realize that sometimes we say, oh, so-and-so is this, but they're not. But we have to go through the thing and say, make him the official poet laureate, okay? And what happened, Daisy had died before, right? And what happened, it was difficult to get Sterling out of the house, okay? We started saying, we're gonna honor you, make you the first poet laureate. We had to almost bribe him, But I tell you this, putting Sterling Brown in the cab, going back with his proclamation, making him the poet laureate of DC, was worth it. I mean, you say, okay, why are you majoring in Afro-American studies? For a moment like this, that you see that you can give something that had been denied to an elder, that recognition. And I say this too in terms of something Dean Crawford, who was Dean of the Chapel at Howard, who in a moment of reflection said, I'm here saying the last words of all these great black men, who I preside over here at Rankin Chapel. And what happened, some of them never got their due, okay, while they were living. And so for us to make Sterling Brown the poet laureate, he was very, very happy at that moment. And I tell the other thing, a person who has to be given credit, two people have to be credited, Marion Effie Barry. You didn't have to go to the city and say, well, should we make Sterling Brown the poet laureate of DC? Because Baron Barry knew about strong men. That's why he got elected over and over again. But what happened? Sterling Brown was a poet that was very important to him. Effie Barry loved Sterling Brown. And I say that because what happened? You can't separate the culture from the politics. Okay? And that is very, very important. And we see that in the life of Sterling Brown. And I also mentioned one other name that's special. You see how the family is here? Okay, and that's a Roy Lewis moment, okay? And what happened, you could say that Roy Lewis is the official photographer for Sterling Brown, okay? And what happened, Roy, right? And that is very important. And this is why sometimes, I think you might have did it, James. We see Roy here, right? And I learned this from going places and say, okay, we're gonna invite some musicians to play, right? And they play, but you don't ever get them to hear them to talk. Okay, so what happens? Sometimes you have to be up here, Roy, because you have another experience and you've documented a lot of things, and those stories need to be heard. I've been in too many programs in which we have musicians playing, but we don't get to hear them talk. Okay, and I like how you got the family together. This is one of those shots that you have a camera, I have a cell phone. It's a difference. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. All right. Okay. Right, that's how it is. Well, on this family note, I want to thank all you because you are family here. You've made all the work that Jonetta has put into this meaningful, and I want to thank you all for coming.